the dim corridors of history, where governments bury truths beneath redacted lines and locked vaults, some files refuse to stay silent. This is not the war you learned in school, not the patriotic banners or speeches of triumph. This is the war hidden in the margins, where decisions were made in smoke-filled rooms, and evidence was burned before it could speak. 4 separate archives, long thought destroyed, resurface like ghosts from the ruins of the Second World War. They carry names that should have never been forgotten. Massacres concealed by uneasy allies, scientists rewritten into heroes, atrocities shielded in exchange for knowledge, and cities burned into silence by those who claimed liberation. Each file carries the weight of secrecy so dangerous, so destabilizing, that entire governments agreed to erase them from collective memory. What follows is not rumor nor myth, but fragments of classified reports, diplomatic cables, missing trial transcripts, and testimonies once silenced. You are about to step into the shadows of World War II, not the one printed in textbooks, but the one deliberately hidden. These are the erased files, resurfacing at last, piece by unsettling piece. Chapter 1. The Classified Katyn Massacre Reports. The forest of Katyn lies quiet, a dense canopy of pines near Smolensk in western Russia. But in the spring of 1943, that silence was broken. German soldiers, advancing into Soviet-held territory, stumbled upon shallow mounds beneath the trees. What they uncovered sent shockwaves through wartime Europe. Thousands of corpses, bound at the wrists, with single bullet wounds at the base of the skull. Each body was still clad in the uniforms of the Polish officer corps, leather belts, insignias, diaries, and letters, dated before the Soviet-German conflict confirmed what the bodies already testified. These men had not died in battle. They had been executed, systematically, and buried in mass graves that stretched into the forest like open wounds. The victims were not random. They were Poland's intellectual and military elite. Officers, doctors, professors, lawyers, priests. Men selected not for their crimes, but for their capacity to lead. In 1940, following the Soviet invasion of eastern Poland under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, took more than 20,000 prisoners from camps at Kozelsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov. According to surviving Soviet orders, the executions were authorized by Lavrentiy Beria, head of the NKVD, and signed off by Joseph Stalin himself. The method was chillingly precise. Prisoners were transported in groups, their records carefully documented, then shot in the back of the head. Trucks carried the bodies to burial sites in Katyn and other locations such as Kharkiv and Mednoy. Each site was meant to remain secret forever. When the Germans announced their discovery in April 1943, they invited neutral observers and the International Red Cross to examine the graves. Forensic experts from occupied countries conducted autopsies, confirming the executions had occurred in 1940, a time when the area was under Soviet control. But the truth was politically inconvenient. The Soviet Union was then a crucial ally against Hitler, and the Western powers could not afford a rupture. In London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill received reports from the Polish government in exile, who demanded accountability. His response was cold, recorded in classified Foreign Office memos. "We shall not raise this matter now or in the future. The truth may never be known." To acknowledge Soviet guilt was to risk shattering the fragile alliance holding the Eastern Front together. In Washington, the same decision was made. American intelligence had access to Polish testimonies, as well as early intercepts suggesting Soviet involvement. Yet President Franklin Roosevelt, mindful of Soviet sacrifices against Germany, ordered silence. Files from the US State Department, marked restricted circulation, revealed directives to dismiss German revelations as propaganda. Polish leaders in exile, furious at the betrayal, found themselves ostracized. Their calls for international investigation were labeled divisive, their voices muted by Allied censorship. Even the Catholic Church in Poland, which preserved letters from priests executed in Katyn, was pressured into silence. The price of suppression was staggering. At Nuremberg in 1946, Soviet prosecutors attempted to charge the Nazis with the Katyn murders, presenting fabricated evidence that the executions occurred in 1941 after the German invasion. The tribunal, overwhelmed with mountains of Nazi crimes, allowed the charge to remain ambiguous. Only decades later, in the late 20th century, did documents emerge revealing that Stalin's government had ordered the massacre and that Allied leaders knew, but colluded in burying the truth. Among the most damning files are transcripts from 1952 US congressional hearings, where witnesses testified that Roosevelt had deliberately withheld evidence to avoid embarrassing the Soviets during wartime. To this day, the Katyn file symbolizes the cruel calculus of wartime diplomacy. The massacre itself was an atrocity, but the erasure of its truth, the deliberate silencing of grieving families, and the rewriting of historical record represent a second crime, committed not with bullets, but with ink and silence. Katyn was not just about the thousands who died in the forest. It was about the world's willingness to look away, to erase suffering for the sake of alliances. The forest remains, its trees whispering in the wind, but beneath its soil lie the ghosts of officers whose memory was buried twice, once by Soviet executioners and once by their supposed allies. Chapter 2. Operation Paperclip's Forbidden Nazi Dossiers. The Second World War did not end neatly with Germany's surrender in May 1945. As Berlin lay in ruins and Hitler's Reich dissolved, another war began in the shadows. It was not fought with tanks or artillery, but with paper dossiers, code names, and covert flights in the night. At its heart was Operation Paperclip, a classified program launched by the United States Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency. Its mission: to recruit German scientists, engineers, and military experts before the Soviets could claim them. What the public was told was liberation. What the archives reveal is a calculated rewriting of history, where men complicit in Nazi crimes were reborn as pioneers of the American future. Among the most infamous of these men was Wernher von Braun, the rocket engineer who designed the V-2 missile. His innovations terrorized London, raining destruction on civilian neighborhoods in 1944 and 1945. His research facility at Peenemünde relied heavily on forced labor drawn from concentration camps, where prisoners worked under starvation, disease, and brutal guards. The Mittelwerk tunnels, where the rockets were assembled, became mass graves in their own right. Thousands of slave laborers died under horrific conditions. Yet when the war ended, von Braun and more than 100 of his team were quietly transferred to the United States. Their SS memberships erased, their records sanitized. In Texas and Alabama, they became architects of America's rocket program, celebrated decades later for placing men on the moon. Von Braun was not alone. Dr. Hubertus Strughold, later hailed as the father of space medicine, conducted human experiments in Dachau concentration camp, exposing prisoners to freezing conditions and low-pressure chambers to simulate high-altitude flight. Documents linking him to these atrocities were hidden in restricted army medical files, stamped with the Paperclip insignia. Kurt Blome, a high-ranking Nazi doctor involved in chemical and biological warfare experiments, was indicted for war crimes at Nuremberg. Yet he was acquitted under suspicious circumstances and later recruited by American intelligence to contribute to biological weapons research. These were not isolated cases, but part of a larger pattern of concealment. The justification, spelled out in internal memoranda between the Pentagon and the newly formed CIA, was simple. The Soviets could not be allowed to gain an advantage. In October 1946, the Soviet Union launched its own operation, codenamed Osoaviakim, seizing thousands of German specialists and shipping them eastward. The race for mines was as urgent as the race for territory. American officials argued that if the United States did not act, Moscow would. The moral compromises, though acknowledged privately, were buried beneath layers of redaction. Even President Harry Truman, when informed, was told the scientists had only nominal Nazi ties. The truth that many were dedicated party members, some complicit in slave labor and war crimes, was deliberately omitted. In 1947, Operation Paperclip brought its recruits across the Atlantic under false identities. They arrived quietly in New York and Boston, traveling under military escort. In Fort Bliss, Texas, and later at Redstone Arsenal in Alabama, they were given laboratories, housing, and security clearance. American newspapers were told nothing. Families of V-2 victims in London and Antwerp never knew that the men responsible now walked free under US protection. Internal FBI reports, later declassified, show repeated warnings about the backgrounds of these men. But their concerns were overruled by the Department of Defense. Past associations, one memo reads, should not hinder the exploitation of their scientific expertise. the secrecy extended into the highest levels of government. In 1952, the newly created NASA absorbed many of these scientists, their Nazi histories scrubbed from official biographies. Von Braun became the face of American rocketry, appearing on television with Walt Disney, smiling beside astronauts, his past cloaked in silence. Meanwhile, survivors of the Mittelwerk tunnels received no justice, their testimonies buried in untranslated German documents. When investigative journalists attempted to raise questions in the 1960s, they were dismissed as conspiracy theorists. Files remained classified until the 1980s, when fragments of Paperclip's reality began to leak into the public record. But even today, the full scope of Paperclip remains obscured. A 1985 Department of Justice report admitted that over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were recruited, many with direct ties to the Nazi war machine. Yet dozens of names remain redacted, their files missing or destroyed. Photographs of early rocket launches, celebrating scientific triumphs, conceal the erased biographies of men who once designed weapons for Hitler. Every successful launch carried not only American ambition, but also the silent legacy of compromised justice. Forbidden dossiers of Operation Paperclip expose more than recruitment. They expose a pattern of deliberate amnesia. In the hunger for technological supremacy, war crimes were ignored, victims silenced, and perpetrators rebranded as heroes. These men walked freely, their crimes erased, while their victims remained nameless, buried in mass graves or unmarked tunnels. Operation Paperclip was not just a program, it was a pact, one signed in ink but sealed with silence, ensuring that certain truths of the war would remain buried, classified, and forbidden to speak aloud. Chapter 3. The Erased Unit 731. Atrocities. Hidden in the cold plains of Manchuria, outside the city of Harbin, stood a facility that appeared to be no more than a military research station. It was surrounded by fences, guard towers, and secrecy. But inside, beneath the banners of the Imperial Japanese Army, horrors were conducted that eclipse even the darkest pages of wartime history. The site was known as Unit 731, commanded by General Shiro Ishii, a physician and bacteriologist who twisted science into an instrument of mass death. For years, the Japanese military concealed its true purpose, describing it as a water purification facility. In reality, it was the epicenter of some of the most grotesque human experiments ever performed under the guise of research. Prisoners of war and civilians alike were used as experimental material. They were called maruta, meaning logs, a dehumanizing term that stripped them of identity and life. Victims included Chinese peasants, Russian captives, Korean forced laborers, and even American and British prisoners. Behind locked doors, they were exposed to pathogens such as plague, anthrax, cholera, and typhoid. Entire villages were deliberately infected, their populations left to die in agony as data was collected. Inside the compound, doctors performed vivisections on living subjects without anesthesia, dissecting organs to observe the effects of disease in real time. Others were frozen alive, their limbs shattered to study the progression of frostbite, while still more were placed in pressure chambers until their eyes burst from their sockets. The number of deaths is impossible to calculate precisely, but historians estimate tens of thousands perished under the flag of Unit 731. As Japan neared defeat in 1945, Unit 731 sought to erase its crimes. Buildings were torched, documents burned, and surviving prisoners executed. General Ishii ordered staff to keep silent and destroy all traces of their activities. Yet not everything vanished. Soviet troops advancing into Manchuria captured several doctors, and testimonies gathered during the Khabarovsk war crimes trials in December 1949 revealed fragments of the truth. Witnesses described plague bombs tested on civilian populations, experiments with glanders and syphilis, and deliberate contamination of water supplies. But these trials were dismissed in the West as Soviet propaganda. For decades, the United States government refused to acknowledge the credibility of the confessions, a silence born not of ignorance, but of complicity. Declassified documents show that General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Japan, struck a secret bargain in 1947. Instead of facing prosecution at Tokyo's International Military Tribunal for the Far East, Unit 731's leaders were granted immunity in exchange for their research data. The US Army's Chemical Corps and later the CIA viewed the information as invaluable for biological warfare programs. Files marked top secret detail the negotiations, in which American intelligence agreed to suppress evidence of atrocities in return for exclusive access to the data. Ishii himself reportedly briefed US officials in Tokyo, handing over his findings while thousands of his victims remained nameless and unburied. The implications were staggering. While Nazi doctors faced trial at Nuremberg and many were hanged for similar crimes, the architects of Unit 731 walked free. Some returned to academic positions in post-war Japan, becoming professors, physicians, and corporate researchers. Others entered the pharmaceutical industry, building careers that shaped modern Japanese medicine. Victims, meanwhile, were denied recognition. Survivors who tried to speak were silenced by fear, while families of the dead received neither apology nor compensation. Only in the late 20th century did Japanese courts begin to hear cases from former victims, and even then, official acknowledgement remained elusive. Evidence of America's cover-up was further exposed in the 1990s, when declassified CIA documents confirmed that Ishii's data had been incorporated into US biological warfare studies at Fort Detrick, Maryland. The files reveal experiments conducted on animals and simulations of plague dispersal in urban settings. Even the Korean War saw accusations of germ warfare, with China and North Korea alleging the use of pathogens. Whether these accusations were true remains debated, but the shadow of Unit 731 loomed large over every claim. The atrocities that should have been condemned were instead absorbed into the fabric of the Cold War. Today, the site of Unit 731 in Harbin has been converted into a museum, its ruins preserved as testimony to the crimes committed there. But the full truth remains buried beneath layers of missing files, destroyed documents, and the silence of governments that found it convenient to forget. The erased history of Unit 731 is not merely about the monstrous cruelty inflicted on its victims. It is also about the deliberate decision made in boardrooms and intelligence briefings to trade justice for data. In that exchange, the victims were denied even the dignity of acknowledgement. Their suffering became numbers in secret reports, filed away in cabinets marked classified. The atrocities of Unit 731 remind us that erasure is as powerful as execution. Memory itself was targeted, suppressed by those who feared the truth more than they valued justice. For decades, the victims had no names, no trials, and no recognition, only silence. It was not only a war crime, but a theft of history. A theft committed not only by the perpetrators, but by those who chose to look away, to erase, and to forget. Chapter 4: The Suppressed Dresden Firestorm Files. In February 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed and Allied armies pushed into German territory, the city of Dresden still stood untouched by the kind of devastation that had already consumed Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin. Known as the Florence on the Elbe, Dresden was a cultural jewel, famous for its Baroque architecture, art collections, and music halls. It was also crowded with civilians. Hundreds of thousands of refugees had poured into the city, fleeing the Soviet advance from the east. By mid-February, Dresden's population had swelled to nearly 1 million souls, most of them women, children, and the elderly. What followed in those final days of winter was an assault so overwhelming that even those who planned it later questioned its necessity. The documents surrounding this event, its motives, its execution, and its aftermath would be heavily censored, restricted, and in some cases destroyed. On the evening of February 13, 1945, the Royal Air Force launched the first wave of the Dresden raid. Over 240 Lancaster bombers roared over the city, dropping incendiary devices designed not to target military infrastructure, but to ignite fires in residential blocks. 2 more waves followed, with US Army Air Forces striking the next day. In total, more than 3,900 tons of explosives and incendiaries were released. The result was not just bombing, but firestorm. Entire districts burst into uncontrollable infernos as oxygen was sucked from the streets, flames rising into the night sky like a wall. Temperatures soared high enough to melt glass and fuse brick. Civilians suffocated in shelters or were incinerated in the open, their bodies reduced to ash. Others drowned in fountains and rivers as they sought relief from the heat. Estimates of the dead vary, but contemporary records suggest tens of thousands perished within hours. The official Allied communique framed Dresden as a military target, citing railway yards and industrial plants. But internal memos tell a darker story. Declassified RAF files reveal Dresden had limited military value by February 1945. Instead, Discussions at the British Air Ministry and among planners of Bomber Command emphasized the opportunity to disrupt civilian morale and demonstrate overwhelming air power to the Soviets. One file, long suppressed, referenced Dresden as a test case for incendiary saturation, part of a broader strategic bombing doctrine. US documents later confirmed that American forces were instructed to target the city center, not only railway junctions. The result was less about crippling German logistics and more about unleashing terror. Prime Minister Winston Churchill himself initially praised the raid, calling it a demonstration of Allied strength, but within weeks, as reports of civilian casualties circulated, he distanced himself. In a secret memo to his chiefs of staff on March 28, 1945, Churchill wrote, "The destruction of Dresden remains a serious query against the conduct of Allied bombing." This memo was marked not for publication, and in subsequent histories of the war, Dresden was often reduced to a footnote, overshadowed by the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. When survivors attempted to tell their stories, they faced skepticism, as official casualty numbers were minimized and photographs disappeared from archives. The suppression was deliberate. In post-war Germany, the Soviet occupation used Dresden's ruins as propaganda against the West, while the British and Americans quietly closed their files. Several RAF and US Army Air Forces documents regarding Dresden were reclassified in the 1950s, under the justification that they could damage Allied unity. Photographic evidence collected immediately after the raids was destroyed or hidden in restricted archives. Only in the 1970s did fragments resurface, when independent historians and survivors challenged the sanitized narrative. Even then, the numbers were contested, with some estimates of 100,000 dead dismissed as exaggerations. Official tallies were reduced to 25,000, a figure that minimized the true scale of the firestorm. Beyond numbers, the silence carried strategic weight. Dresden's devastation had served as a warning to the Soviet Union as much as to Germany. By showcasing the destructive capacity of Allied air power, Britain and the United States signaled their dominance in the post-war order. To admit the raid was primarily a political gesture, rather than military necessity, would have undermined the moral authority of the victors. Thus, the files remained closed, testimonies were doubted, and a city reduced to ash was erased from public memory. Survivors lived with scars, burned bodies, lost families, haunted minds, while governments crafted a narrative that omitted them. Today, Dresden stands rebuilt, its Frauenkirche reconstructed from the very stones that once lay in ruins. But the archives still bear the marks of erasure, missing pages, redacted memos, destroyed photographs. The firestorm of February 1945 was not just an act of war, it was an act of silencing. The destruction was too great, the civilian toll too vast, the motives too unsettling for the victors to admit, and so the truth was hidden, filed away in locked cabinets and secret orders, ensuring that Dresden would remain not a symbol of war's end, but a forbidden chapter in its history. A firestorm erased not only lives but memory itself. In every archive, there are files that never see daylight, pages stamped classified, names blacked out with ink, photographs vanished into restricted cabinets. They do not disappear because they lack significance, but because they carry too much. The 4 files we have uncovered, the Katyn Massacre, Operation Paperclip, Unit 731, and the Dresden Firestorm, were not erased by chance. They were buried with intention, silenced by governments that feared the truth more than they respected it. Each file reveals not only an atrocity, but a pattern. Alliances preserved through lies, justice traded for knowledge, and victory protected by silence. And even as these fragments resurface, the question remains: how many others are still missing? How many forests, laboratories, and cities still hold secrets beneath their soil? The deeper we search, the clearer it becomes. History is not just written by the victors, it is edited by them. What we hold in our hands are not complete truths, but censored testimonies, partial glimpses of shadows. And if these files survived erasure, how many more remain locked away, waiting for someone willing to ask forbidden questions and to open doors governments swore would remain closed forever?